Okay, we should be live. Hello, Internet, and welcome to the fourth annual Shakespeare live stream for Shakespeare's Death Day, Birthday, Baptismal Day week.
Yes.
All of the above. And I'm here with Adam Hooks, who, if you've tuned in former years, you've heard some of his thoughts and introductions, but is there anything else that you'd like to say to introduce yourself today?
I teach Shakespeare.
It's kind of the point of being here today. So my name is Colleen Tyson, and I'm a special collections librarian here at the University of Iowa, and we're here to answer your questions. Any questions you have about Shakespeare. You have a Shakespeare scholar here for 2 hours. You can see our hashtag there, SHX Live for Shakespeare Live. You can type right into the live stream. In our Facebook event and on Twitter, some people have submitted questions ahead of time, so we'll be able to ask those. And otherwise, we also, being in special collections, we have a selection of interesting Shakespeare-related materials from special collections here on hand today that we can show you, all of the above. So let us know what your questions are. I'll be watching the live stream, and so and the Twitter hashtag and the Facebook event page. So if you have a question, type it in the Facebook event page, use the hashtag on Twitter, or type into the live stream.
Or just shout really loudly.
Shout really loudly, and we'll hear you from across the distance in a magical way if you project like a decent actor. Any of the above options. All right, so I'm going to check in on the live stream feed, and Adam, we should start with a question.
I do. I want to start with the Romeo and Juliet question.
Oh, okay. Which one is that?
This one.
Okay, this is from Janine Walsh McCarthy. So I do want to give a shout out. Also, let us know in the feed and on Twitter if there's any problems with the audio, if you can hear us right now. I'm checking the notifications, so if they say they can't hear us, so far so good. I think we're fine, but do check in and let us know if there's any challenges with the speed, and we'll get it quickly fixed up. So we are being joined today by quite a few fans and followers from the Old Nerd Fighters group on Facebook. So thank you, Nerd Fighters, for tuning in and for all of your questions. They're really great and range all across the board. So we're really excited to answer them today. So the first one is from Janine, who asks, my son is a freshman in high school, and his English class has started reading Romeo and Juliet this week. He's super psyched about it, but some of his classmates definitely are not, which makes me wonder what Shakespeare scholars think about Shakespeare and the modern audience, specifically teens, many of whom will study 3 or 4 Shakespeare plays in high school. Obviously, Shakespeare's longevity already proves that his work speaks to multiple generations, but I'd love to know if your scholar, Adam Hooks, has thoughts on how, why, if it still connects, especially to young people today. My son said Romeo and Juliet is his favorite thing, and he's read and reading it in class this year. So there's at least a few kids out there who are really excited about it. Take it away, Adam.
Just say, first of all, you've done an excellent job parenting. If your son, his favorite text for the year is Romeo and Juliet, that's fantastic. All of my students have read Romeo and Juliet, most of them in 9th grade. Most of them hate it because of that experience. So you should also compliment your son's Shakespeare teacher, who's doing a great job bringing the play to life. I think that for that particular play, a lot of people come to it with so many preconceptions about its importance as a love story. And so, unfortunately, that means they don't always pay attention to what the play is about. Because what the play is really about, let's see, a few things I talk to my students about. A melancholic kid who writes really bad poetry. I mean, really, it's just awful, and he never gets any better through the course of the play. What happens when rich young men have too much time on their hands, it's hot outside, and they have access to weapons? Well, surprise, surprise, people get stabbed for no good reason. Fights over money. That's another thing that the play is about. But centrally, it is about Juliet. I taught this play in my Shakespeare's poetry class this semester, and my students and I call it Juliet and Romeo, or just the tragedy of Juliet, because um, her language is so very powerful in the play. She really, to the extent that the play is about the two characters in the title, it is about Juliet elevating Romeo. She's the one who understands what the problems are in the world in which they find themselves, which is, um, she understands the artificiality of the feud. She understands the power of language, and she fights against those boundaries that others have used to suppress them.
While you keep thinking about Juliet, I'm seeing an alert that the stream isn't at a high enough bit rate, so I'm going to go grab a cord and plug in instead of using the Wi-Fi, which I should have done to start with. But I'm going to disappear for a second and deal with some technical issues, and you keep thinking about Juliet.
I'll just keep talking.
Just a second.
As my students will tell anyone, it's not really a problem for me to keep talking. So anyway, Juliet rocks. Favorite characters in all of Shakespeare. It's a wonderful play, intimately connected in all sorts of ways with Shakespeare's identity as a poet in the 1590s. But it's the other part of the question is really interesting, because it's not so much about this one particular play, but about how young people
4 years of this, we had to have technical difficulties at some point. I think we are back. We are fully connected, and we're ready to move on with today's event. So thanks for sticking with us. Keep typing your questions in the live stream. I'm watching that now. Type your questions on Twitter with SHX Live, and we'll get back to Adam Hooks, who was talking about how awesome Juliet is. We were talking about how awesome Juliet is.
Juliet is really awesome.
Yeah. And how does that play continue to connect with teens? What do you have any thoughts about that?
So that was the other part of the original question here. Oh man, creepy Shakespeare.
I can get him in the hair. He'll just hang out sort of headless right there. All right, now we're ready.
What do you think? I don't really care what you think. Yeah, that was the other part of the question, is how young people interact with Shakespeare plays, particularly Romeo and Juliet, I suppose. I mean, there are two problems with a question like this to some degree, and one is that, as I tell my students, Shakespeare is not broccoli. Like, it won't make you a better person the more of it you're force-fed. And this derives in part from Shakespeare's kind of cultural value, or the kind of dominance of Shakespeare. The second thing, and Katie, if you're watching, I just ran into you downstairs and you threatened to use this word, but I'm going to preempt you from doing so. The other problem is that some young students either want the plays to be, or think the plays are not the dreaded R word, which is relatable.
Oh.
Which no one is ever allowed to use in my classroom, ever, for all sorts of reasons that I've already talked about elsewhere. But there are other things that you can learn from a play like Romeo and Juliet, such as the power of language and how language works. And I know this firsthand because here's a shout out to all the language arts teachers at West High School, particularly Katie Nara's class. Katie invited me out to help teach Romeo and Juliet to 9th graders, which was such a blast. One of the best moments I've ever had as a teacher is explaining to them in the last act exactly what the dual meaning of the word die is.
Do you want to explain the dual meaning of the word die?
Oh, as I told them, it also means to have an orgasm. So Juliet, that is a really happy dagger.
I bet that went over with the 9th grade crowd. Was it 8th grade or 9th grade?
9th grade?
9th grade?
They were kind of... Yeah.
All of the above.
It was all of the above. It was every possible reaction, from incredulity, snickering, outright disgust, laughter, and lots and lots and lots of how old are 9th graders?
14,
like
15.
Lots of 14-year-old girls turning 8 degrees of pink while laughing at each other.
Shakespeare, taking 14-year-olds through the entire range of human emotional experience.
Yes.
I also read Romeo and Juliet in 9th grade.
And what did you think?
I was predisposed to like it. I mean, there's sort of the idea, at least the idea that was transferred to me was that I was supposed to like it. So it's hard to tease out all of those different things. It was my first introduction to the language. And so that's a lot of what, because I hadn't read any in junior high. So that was my very first introduction to Shakespeare. And I had a really hilarious teacher, Miss Schmidt, and that helped a lot too. Yeah, but so for me, I was really focused on the language and like adjusting to that for the first time. We watched one of the movies, and then we had to memorize passages and recite them, which I can still do, by the way.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is what websites get wrong, because the least interesting thing about a Shakespeare play is the plot. Like, everyone knew the story of Romeo and Juliet before they got to the theater. It's no surprise that they end up dead. It's how they end up dead. That's the really interesting thing about it. And it's also just, I mean, Juliet has just a remarkable ability to put words to the desire that she feels. I mean, this is something that my students were wondering. Like, how did Shakespeare write the part of Juliet to be so intense? I didn't have a good answer to the question, but I mean, at least they recognized that it was intense.
I've met intense 14-year-olds, 12, 13-year-olds.
Yeah, I had one student in particular this semester who was really fixated on the idea that these people can't be 13 years old, and I did remind them that this is a play, not real life. It's just a good thing to remember for all the Shakespeareans out there.
I also try not to underestimate teenagers, you know, especially the way the word millennial is bandied about. Though I suppose our current teenagers aren't millennials, but there's such disdain for young people, and young people have just as much of a range as everybody else.
That is true.
Mm-hmm. So I think they can be 13. You can feel things at 13.
Juliet definitely feels things.
Do you feel like you are wrapping up this question? Do you have more things you want to say?
I want to, can we get Emily's carousel out just for a second?
Yes, absolutely.
I'm going to remove.
All right, we're moving on to a book portion, and then we'll get back to, yeah, that'd be good. I thought about tipping it just a bit too. There we go. You can put him away. That's fine. I got my moment with the Shakespeare statue in the stream. We're fine. So we have brought along lots of different editions of interesting Shakespeare-related works. Some of them are historic. Some of them are new artist book interpretations of Shakespeare's works, and we have one book. I don't know. We'll have to leave it to you. Is this a book or not a book?
No,
this one,
the
yeah.
circly one
Oh. Because we were talking about Romeo and Juliet.
We were talking about Romeo and Juliet.
Okay, so this is a work from Emily Martin. It is called The Gist of Romeo and Juliet. It's essentially a test for an idea that she then went on to make other editions. And so the book opens like a codex. I'm going to get this camera in just a moment, but let's see if we can get the... No. I'm going to do that from above so we can get the dramatic carousel reveal. Okay. All right. Ready to come along, folks? I'm going to move the camera. Don't get queasy. All right, because we want to see this from above. All right.
Ready?
Almost. Yep. A carousel. All right, well, nice experiment. Here, we're going to go back. All right, so this particular work is folded up like a book when it's closed, but then opens all the way around in a circle. So it's popularly called a carousel format for some obvious reasons. What would you like to say about this work, Adam?
I want to say just a couple quick things, because this was a prototype for the actual finished product that ended up winning an award. But the original question about how different generations understand Shakespeare's plays, this was one of the guiding principles behind Emily's process as she started making this particular book, which ended up being set, each of the openings here tracking each of the 5 acts of the play, with text setting the act in a different cultural geographical location around the world. So if you're thinking about, oh, Romeo and Juliet's a love story, there is love for one of them, but there's also sex and violence and stupidity, one of my favorites, and death.
And death. Here, yep, I'm gonna try to get a better shot of that. So just hold on. There we go. It's just that it does opposite, so it messes with my brain. There we go.
Death. Love, death, and stupidity, that's all the boys.
There are a few girls too. Maybe in the show, in the play.
It's mostly the boys' fault. It's basically Romeo's fault.
There we go.
But I also like this because when Emily Martin has been producing several artist books based on Shakespeare, but she doesn't just leave special collections with the finished product, she leaves the process as well. And we've got a few other examples that we might get to at some point today. So.
Yeah, we hold Emily Martin's personal papers as well, so it's a really great opportunity to see several different works in process as they go along, and not just the finished product, which is really valuable for our Center for the Book Students here at the University of Iowa as well.
I'm going to relate this to one question that I had. It was sent to me from a Shakespeare class at a different institution that has totally flummoxed me. I have no idea how to answer it.
Excellent.
So I'm just going to ask it and see if anyone else out there has any idea. So, I mean, in part, it was about the fact that Shakespeare is used in education and you tend to read it as a young person, at least since, you know, the late 19th, early 20th century, when Shakespeare becomes a part of English curricula. You have phenomena like the Bowdler's family Shakespeare, so that you have you know, a family copy of Shakespeare that presumably could be read aloud communally, which would include the children. You know, there are Bowdlerized versions of Shakespeare's plays that are meant for children, and that's a phenomenon that I think has been studied and documented. But the question that I had never thought of, the part of the question that I never thought of, is how did young people in the 16th and 17th centuries interact with Shakespeare? Like in what forms would that take? And I frankly had no idea. I've never thought about that because we tend to only think of Shakespeare's audiences and Shakespeare's readers as literate adults. So I really have no clue. I mean, there are clearly examples of possibly children doodling in copies of Shakespeare. You know, there's a few examples like that in some of the first folios that have been looked at. But I really have no idea about how young people would have interacted. I mean, I suppose there are stories about apprentices, you know, riding outside the theaters. That's not exactly children, but it is. It's a really interesting question, and at the very least valuable for broadening our view of what Shakespeare's audience would be.
There's such a tradition of Shakespeare's plays being embedded in 20th century education. How far back do you think we have a sense of that being connected with younger people?
With education?
With education.
It's not that far.
19th
century. That you have Shakespeare being used, not if you think about education beyond the grammar school curriculum, you know, in the 19th century, particularly, you have all sorts of moralistic educational uses for Shakespeare. I mean, this is part of the reason the women's Shakespeare clubs were so popular. We've got some excellent materials there from the Iowa Women's Archive, from women's Shakespeare clubs in Iowa.
Yeah, from several different cities in Iowa, especially the Marion Shakespeare Club has some really fantastic scrapbooks. We had one of them on display while the Shakespeare's First Folio was here, but if you're interested in the history, there are still existing women's Shakespeare clubs that have continued for more than 100 years around Iowa. So that's a fascinating history of the study of Shakespeare if anyone's interested. And every year there's funding to come and research in the Iowa Women's Archives. So watch for that also, and come and study women's Shakespeare clubs. That's my pitch as a special collections librarian.
Yeah, I just tweeted out we had an English honors student do a digital project for her honors thesis on the Marion Women's Shakespeare Club, which is awesome. So I just tweeted a link out there. Christina's work deserves a broad audience, that's for sure. What's next?
Well, we have lots more questions.
Cool.
We just got a question in the live stream from Jennifer Eric, who asks, with all the trees blooming and leafing from beyond our walls, I picked this one because it's a follow-up from the Women's Shakespeare Clubs too. I wonder what you make of all the botanical references in Shakespeare, and do you have a favorite botanical reference, or any thoughts about their significance? I brought this up because in the women's Shakespeare clubs in Iowa, in the history of the women's Shakespeare clubs would make Shakespeare gardens. And one of them in Cedar Rapids, unfortunately, was destroyed by the flood, but recently the Cedar Rapids Shakespeare Club has been trying to bring it back. So there's a history of sort of digging out some of the botanical references in the women's clubs and planting Shakespeare-related gardens. And if you have any thoughts on that.
I have, I'll say a couple of things. I took one of my classes over to the John Martin Rare Book Room at the Hardin Health Sciences Library on campus, which is awesome. And we got to see all sorts of crazy anatomy books and science books and monster books and surgery books and botanicals.
The best botanicals are over in the medical library.
Yeah, really fabulous early examples of botanical manuals, some of them hand colored, hand coloring the illustrations, which was fantastic. And they did bring out a couple of the kind of famous Shakespeare references to flowers and plants. I'm pretty sure Ophelia was the central example, as she's handing out flowers with various significances to the other people at court, which is a really interesting moment on stage as well, because there's really no real stage directions telling people who she's giving which flowers to, at least for most of them. And so you have like a lot of potential for stage action there. And then also obviously Gertrude's description of Ophelia's death in the river, which inspired maybe too many pre-Raphaelite paintings about depicting Ophelia and her death. And actually, I will also say this, because I teach Hamlet on a relatively regular basis, it catches the attention of my students. And so I did have one student this semester, or last semester, I don't know which semester, sometime, a student kind of combine pictorial images of Ophelia with an analysis of how she's using flowers in that play.
All right, so there is a deep botanical history there and a history of finding those references and then actually bringing that to life as a garden, which you can find if you are interested in the history of women's Shakespeare clubs.
Yeah, and this also relates to another question I had from a student, which I think is a really good question that my own students have asked, which is, I'm also thinking of this because I read a similar constellation of texts in the Shakespeare class I taught last fall, where we read Hamlet and Macbeth and Julius Caesar, and the student in this class has read the same set of plays and is wondering, why are there no death scenes for these women in these plays? And that's a really good question. The answer that's kind of a cheat would be like, it's really difficult to stage Portia swallowing hot coals, which is how she commits suicide in that play. Really difficult to stage, but as my students said last semester, it's a pretty badass way to go. I mean, she's the one who stabs herself to prove her loyalty to her husband earlier in the play, and so like, basically they were frustrated that there was not more Portia in the play because she seemed by far the most reasonable character, for all sorts of different reasons, right? I get frustrated at the fact that it's just like men talking and messing things up. Just pretty much a good description of most Shakespeare plays. I don't have a good explanation for why the actual death scenes don't take place on stage. I mean, similarly, Gertrude's speech, which evokes this beautiful scene of Ophelia's drowning in the river. Of course, you could never stage that, but it's such a memorable speech in the play. So it's putting the emphasis on using language to describe this particular imagery, but it also gives, I don't know, it gives her a kind of peaceful, absent presence and makes our attention, it focuses our attention on imagining Ophelia, which is why film versions that do the whole, the flashback or show us something that you can't do on stage, I often find objectionable. And in fact, my favorite film version of Ophelia's death scene is
That's what I was going to ask.
Shakespeare the Animated Tales. Yes, for real. Done back in the 1980s or 90s. The Hamlet was done by Russian animators with a very particular technique that I cannot describe. But Ophelia.
1992 to 1994.
Yeah, it's really fantastic. And Ophelia, all you hear is a splash, and then a bird takes flight and ascends into the sky, and it takes about a minute and a half, and it's very quiet. And when I play it for my classes and turn the lights back on, everyone has a little tear in their eye from seeing it. This is very moving. The other thing I will say about this question is that yes, those three women characters do die off stage, but they sure get a hell of a scene before they go. Ophelia with the flowers, and Lady Macbeth in the sleepwalking scene as well. I mean, these are, I always stress to my students that the number of lines that it takes to get through that scene is not an indication of the stage presence that it has, because one of the things that you are guaranteed to remember after seeing a production of Hamlet or Macbeth is Ophelia and Lady M. Like, theatrically, they are far more present than they are as it might appear on the page. So that's what I have to say about that. Oh, let's see. Goodness.
We do have a few questions on our Twitter.
Yeah.
And we still have a lot of questions from yesterday from our Facebook. And so it depends on which direction you want to go. You can always look at another book.
So this is, we're getting into booky books. I'm going to start with this question, which is also from a student in a Shakespeare class who's working on a final, I think working on a final project about the different texts of Hamlet.
Okay.
Which will get us towards, I think, some of those questions there. Something along the lines of, considering the different textual versions of Hamlet, how do editors decide in the 21st century which bits to include in a critical, modern critical edition? Particularly when there are lines missing from the second quarto that are in the folio, or vice versa. This is a very complicated question. It has been answered in very many different ways. It's actually a much more interesting question now after the Arden third series edition of Hamlet, which all the experts will know is in 2 volumes and prints the 3 separate texts of Hamlet separately. So it makes no attempt to conflate versions.
So the answer being, don't pick. Put them all there and let people pick for themselves, or compare and contrast.
It is really useful. I've found to teach Q1 alongside the more standard texts.
And do you want to explain what Q1 is? Just because we have people with a lot of different levels of knowledge of Shakespeare tuning in.
There are 3 different texts of Hamlet. The first one, published in 1603, we call the first quarto because it's published in a quarto format. It's about half as long as the Hamlet you're familiar with, and there's a ton of textual differences.
Mm-hmm.
The second quarto, published the next year, advertised as a lengthier, more complete text. And then the version in the first folio, which is yet another text, similar in many ways to the second quarto, but with a ton of differences. And as Zach Lesser has written a whole book about, no one knew about Q1 until the early 19th century, when it exploded Shakespeare studies as it was known, by providing this radically different version of what had already become Shakespeare's most famous play. The Arden 3 edition is both the best example of and the exhausted limit case of the mode of editing that gives full and complete attention to each individual version of a text, and refusing to make an argument about the relationships among the texts. And Zach in his book provides a critique of that in the epilogue. So we're at a moment when we're going to have to rethink how we think about the relationships, the complicated relationships among different versions of Shakespeare texts. Now that we know that it is a good thing to pay attention to different versions of Shakespeare texts for all sorts of different reasons, we can move beyond that and see what might be able to come next. I don't have the answer for that, but it is an interesting thing to think about, and something that I've thought about with my students as well. We often do editing exercises in class, or at the very least argue with the editor, and not only the ways that particular lines or passages are glossed, but the decision to gloss particular passages and words, or the decision not to gloss particular passages and words. For my poetry class this semester, we used Colin Burrow's Oxford edition of the complete sonnets and poems, and so it often felt like Colin Burrow was like a character in my class, or somehow an absent presence in my class, and we were constantly arguing with him or giving him credit for explaining things that are really complicated. Although, I mean, English majors like to argue with people, so it's mostly arguing with people.
I was an art history major, and I had the same thing. My final question at the end of one of my classes was just, what would the book editor say about this idea? And I loved it. To me, it was one of the most creative and interesting essay questions that I'd ever been asked on a final exam. It was a bonus question. what can you do? So, did the theater audiences know how to read? And if so, did they read?
Yes. I will elaborate.
Great. Okay, done.
This actually relates to that earlier question about audience. So not all playgoers were on equal footing as far as literacy goes. So there were playgoers and people who watched plays that could not read or maybe did not want to read. But we also know that there is a fair amount of text circulating around in and around the theater. Tiffany Stern has done a lot of work on this, documents on stage, signs perhaps that clue you into the location, possibly people selling playbooks in or near the theater, because why wouldn't you? That's a target audience. Title pages of printed plays were posted around London as a form of advertisement. We know playbills were printed. We just don't have any surviving from Shakespeare's era. And we know people took notebooks, commonplace books, their little tablets to the theater that they could scribble down notes from the play and then go home and insert into their commonplace book. So yeah, there's a fair amount of reading and writing happening in the theater. Not always, and it depends on the audience, obviously. But yeah, I mean, like why would people go to the trouble of printing plays if people didn't want to read them?
Well, if we are talking about printing, so that question was from Hugo. Thank you. I know you tuned in last year too. I was going to ask you about this one.
Yeah,
if that seems good. So this one's from Uta. How did Shakespeare finance his work? Like, did he get funds from the crown, or did he sell his plays, or how did the financial side of this endeavor work?
Shakespeare was somewhat idiosyncratic in that he was a sharer in his theater company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, and then the King's Men after King James took the throne. What that means is that as a sharer, so he put up an initial investment for the small group of central actors who ran the theater company and were responsible for the business side of things. That means that each of the sharers got a cut in the profits for performances. And so, I mean, this gave Shakespeare a degree of financial security and freedom that most writers did not have. You know, the kinds of jobbing writers who are selling play scripts to theater companies, collaborating with each other, maybe selling some work for a modest fee to printers as well. I mean, as always, you don't make money as a writer. And Shakespeare didn't make money as a writer either. It was the fact that he was a central member in his company and would have had then like responsibilities to provide play scripts on a regular basis. But that's how he made his money. That's how he bought his large house in Stratford. That's how he acquired property, both in London and particularly back in Stratford. He didn't get rich. I mean, he made coming from the class status that he came from. I mean, the provincial son of a glover in a market town, to the kind of status of you know, a recognized authority within Stratford, within the town. That came from his kind of privileged status in the theater, and so, you know, he made enough so that in his will he was able to provide for the financial security of his family and his surviving children. So that, I mean, and it also puts him in a somewhat idiosyncratic role as a writer, and then he gets to work with the same theater company for a sustained period of time. So in part shaping the plays to the strengths of particular actors and particular ensembles, which is also something that is not unique necessarily, but is responsible in some ways for the shape of the Shakespeare canon.
So in working with that theater company, you said he has a certain expectation of delivering a certain amount of plays, but then he's also acting.
He's also acting.
And Uta's follow-up question was he any good? Is there any like known information on that? I mean, that may not be something that's known, but it's certainly something I've not thought about before.
There's not really any. I will say this: there is evidence of Shakespeare being an actor. I mean, he is listed in the list of actors in the first folio. It includes a list of actors in these plays. He's also listed elsewhere as an actor in one of Ben Jonson's plays. We don't know at all how long he kept acting or what roles he played. We only have kind of hearsay and stories from much later that say Shakespeare played the ghost in Hamlet because it's just too perfect, right? Because of course, or like the roles of minor roles, maybe of older gentlemen. So I'm teaching As You Like It right now. So the character of Adam, the faithful, loyal, good servant to flighty Orlando. That could have been a role that he would have played. We have no idea, and really those stories were only a result of this desire to isolate Shakespeare from the theater, as if to become Shakespeare, the playwright, the poet, he needs to be isolated in some, isolated in his study, surrounded by books, because we think of him as a literary figure. But it turns out the best way to learn how to write plays really well is to be in plays, in the theater, and work with understanding the resources, both material and personal, that it takes to produce a play. And so there's no reason to think that he stopped acting. But there is a desire to isolate him from the theater, particularly in the second half of his career, when he starts writing what we think of as the big tragedies. That he must have been an isolated genius rather than a working playwright. But turns out he was a working playwright.
So thanks for your questions.
That is a great question.
Do you want to look at a book?
Let's look at a book.
All right.
Let's get the illustrated one that I've never seen before.
Excellent. So this is one that I picked out myself, that I haven't taken a great look at either. But I always like to bring a surprise. So when I was picking out some of the other ones, for those of you who know how Library of Congress call number ranges work, things are categorized by subjects. And so that puts on the shelf books that are like each other all together. And this one was right next to a different one that I was pulling out for today's event. And it just said Shakespeare Illustrated. And Adam, as a scholar, tends to pull out the oldest editions, but the oldest ones don't tend to be illustrated. So I just pulled out something interesting. This one is illustrated by an assemblage of portraits and views adapted to the whole series of that author's historical dramas, to which are added portraits of actors, editors, etc. From London. So I'm going to once again make you dizzy and pull this camera around so that you can see what we're looking at. So hold on just a second. Here we go. So this is what we're taking a look at. Shakespeare Illustrated by an assemblage. And when they say assemblage, they mean it.
We get a nice, beautiful State University of Iowa perforation stamp.
Well, you know, it was the time. I did find it interesting, this introductory statement talks about how they're patrons of this novel, and that they increased the number of plates for delivery. So basically, people subscribed to this book. Oh, I am not pointing this correctly. There we go. People subscribed to this book. And I know in contemporary times, that's not as common of a way to get a book made. We didn't all buy a subscription for Harry Potter to get it published. So let's take a look at some of what we can see in here.
What I really found interesting is that the first several plates are all portraits of well-known Shakespeare editors from the 18th century. This book is dated 1793, so it's right in the thick of all this.
So here's our best friends first.
Oh, I love this.
John Combe from his monument.
This is wonderful. I love this.
Trying to go a little closer.
John Combe was a friend of Shakespeare in Stratford, from the Combe family, which were very wealthy, far wealthier than Shakespeare. And this is his funeral effigy from his funeral monument in Holy Trinity Church. It's behind Shakespeare's grave. So Shakespeare's grave is a very small, it's just a flat slab with an inscription. This monument would have been far more costly. And we know that Shakespeare knew the Combe family because he left his sword to John Combe's brother, I think it was, Thomas Combe. I mean, you don't just leave your sword to anyone. So he's a good acquaintance. The reason I find him so interesting is that later in the 17th century, there are a number of epitaphs circulating that claim to be written by Shakespeare about John Combe. It's not good poetry, at least from what we think, and it's a pretty conventional kind of satire on money lending. It's a little verse stating that the devil is now taken his interest from John Combe.
I'm gonna try to center this a little bit. All right.
It's awesome.
Yay! I picked a good surprise.
And here's the church, Holy Trinity, where Shakespeare is buried. Really interesting church for so many different reasons. It dates back to centuries before Shakespeare's time, and it's a really remarkable example of architecture.
Taken from the water. Or does that say water? Yeah, water. Taken from the water at the very bottom there. I can't get it to focus, but
across the Avon. And here is a portrait of Shakespeare's monument. This is on the wall. It's now on the wall overlooking Shakespeare's gravestone. It's really interesting because it was made in the theatre precinct. It was made in Southwark in London, and so it's possible that it was paid for by Shakespeare's friends in London, because it's not likely that Shakespeare's family would have had the money for something like this.
There we go.
And Shakespeare does not have a tomb, right? So this is a monument, but it's just awkwardly on the wall because Shakespeare is simply buried in that gravestone. So in the first folio, which is the kind of textual version of Shakespeare's tomb, when Ben Jonson says, "Thou art a monument without a tomb," he's literally right, because he has a monument, but he has no tomb. He's just got a gravestone.
All right, I'm going to move back to the book here. All right, so it goes on like that with just portraits and portraits and portraits and portraits throughout, and different locations. Well,
the interesting thing I find here is that it's the historical plays.
oh, yes, specifically.
It's only the histories.
All right, I'm gonna go back.
And it's really interesting because, oh goodness, a scandalous portrait of Jane Shore. Oh my.
Well, now we have to show it.
Yeah.
All right, friends. Can't just remark and then pull it away.
I didn't have you pull up any of the super naughty editions of Venus and Adonis, so you had to
gotta save something for next year
somehow. But yeah, this I've never seen this edition before, but I do find it interesting that it is just the historical plays, but it takes a broader view of what counts as a history play than the damned first folio does. Because there are English history plays, and these are all from the ones that we've been showing are from Richard III, along with portraits of the historical characters and depicted some of the key locations.
What was the year on this one?
1793.
1793. So what I thought was interesting when I pulled it out is just to think about all of the people subscribing to this in 1793 and wanting a book like this with all of these artists compiling and creating illustrations of figures. I mean, this is a medallion of Julius Caesar, so just going through all of these like very related but tangentially related and compiling them all together into this odd compilation.
I think this is the advertisement that Colleen, you mentioned, which talks to the nervous subscribers, basically says we decided to stop making portraits to put in so that we could get this out on time. Yeah. So there is a portrait at the very end of Julius Caesar and of Brutus and of Cicero and Antony, which means that the intention was to include the Roman history plays as well, not just the English history plays, which is how the first folio divides up the genres, which means that they were working with a more expansive view of Shakespeare's plays.
But then at some point, you've just got to get the book out.
Get the book out. But this is really, I like this one. All sorts of good stuff here.
It's all back in the stacks. Library of Congress call number range, bringing them to light again. More questions.
More questions. Should we tilt that a little?
Yeah.
All right, just some good questions. They're all good questions.
There we go. Much better. Hi, friends.
Hello.
We're back.
We've been here for an hour, except for those few minutes when
yeah,
Shaq's live was Shaq's dead.
Yeah, we learned, just in case this is helpful for any of you doing live streams, we learned that you shouldn't plug in an Ethernet cord after you've already started. The computer doesn't like that. Google Hangouts doesn't like that. YouTube doesn't like that. But only took a few moments to come back, so we're glad you stuck with us. Okay, I mean, I have a lot more questions from the Facebook group. If you have something you want to bring out for the students.
I have a couple here that were submitted to me from a Shakespeare class somewhere else. A student who had a class session in the Rare Book Room, looking through old books and kind of seeing what you can learn and experience with old books. And the question was something along the lines of what is the most significant find you could discover in an old book, or what are the kinds of important, significant things that you might discover? And I have to say, I mean, there's always a desire. I think that you should really, this is a great question, especially from a student, because you shouldn't overthink it. you're not going to find, um, it's not every day that you make a kind of groundbreaking Shakespearean discovery. So, for example, back at my alma mater, University of Illinois, where a famous Shakespeare scholar, T.W. Baldwin, worked in the kind of early to mid 20th century. One of the things he discovered as the binding waste in another book was a manuscript list of plays on sale from a bookseller. And one of the titles of the Shakespeare plays on that list was Love's Labour's Won, which is not a play that we have. There is a reference to it in the 1590s, in 1598, in fact, but there was no other information about its existence. But it appears to have existed in some form because it's in a bookseller's list. So you never know what you're going to find.
Yeah.
That's not exactly the kinds of things that you're going to find on a daily basis. This is why, and I'll delay the rant on this for just a little bit, but this is why people keep thinking that they have found Shakespeare's copy of a particular book with Shakespeare's own marginalia, and that this is like the key to solving Shakespeare, which is just wrong on every possible level. But I won't go into that now.
Were they asking that question specifically about Shakespeare finds, or generally?
Not necessarily specifically about Shakespeare. And this is where the really interesting part of the question comes, which is that you have to let the book tell its own story to you. You don't want to pick up a book and try to make an argument or hope that you find a particular thing in the book. I mean, on occasion, like that's happened to me on occasion, when I've been doing research on something, and then I have a hypothesis, or I have an argument that I'm starting to build based on the material that I've collected, and then I go into a special collections library. I remember this happening in the Houghton Library at Harvard once, and opening the book, and almost the first thing that I see during the day was a piece of evidence that perfectly suited, like it was exactly what I was looking for, and it was right there, and it just felt so great because I held on to that feeling. Like I can still feel it right now, because you hold on to those feelings, because like big discoveries, and that's not a big discovery, it was just something about one particular argument that I wanted to make, but confirmed what I was thinking. I mean, that's a fantastic feeling. It doesn't come along every day. So it's better to let the book talk to you. Do the work first. Ask questions of your book. I have a sheet of questions, and Colleen seen me hand it out to numerous classes with a whole list of questions to ask of the book, so that you can create a life story for it.
Yeah, that was one of the inspirations. So on this YouTube channel, one of our playlists is called If Books Could Talk, and that's a series that I did with Heather Waka and Katie Buhner, and that was the guiding question that we asked for that series as well. If we get this, in that case it was a medieval manuscript, but if we put a medieval manuscript in front of us, what can it tell us? How does it tell its story, instead of us coming in with questions like, what pieces of evidence are there, and what questions does that inspire that we can follow and learn about? And it's just it leads to such directions that you'd never expect to go. You should try it. It works with your books at home too.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is something that I try to immerse my students in. So one of my classes had to write a biography of a book from special collections this semester, and for at least a couple of them, it's turning into their final project for this semester. And some of the best examples were basically, I'm interested in this, and so they asked a librarian, give me a book about this randomly, and then working through it that way. One of my students last fall actually found a master's thesis from, I don't know, the 1930s or something, that had because it was not published, it had circulated to other libraries. So there was a record of which libraries and even which patrons, I think, at the other libraries had seen the work of this woman early in the 20th century, which is just fantastic. One of the books, I will plug this a little bit because it will be digitized and online very soon, is our copy of the Bishop's Bible from the 1570s.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to think about a book where you ask the question, you know, what can an old book teach you? That particular Bible is full of every example of everything that you might find by asking an old book, please tell me your story.
Yeah, and I mean, it's an enormous book. We now know it weighs 19 pounds. It's about 5.5 inches thick on the foredge, 5 at the spine. I measured and I made the librarians weigh it. It's been digitized completely. It took hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours for it to be digitized. Thank you, Bethany.
Thank you, Bethany.
I still owe you some chocolate for doing that. But I was able to trace generally this amazing pulpit Bible that was meant for public display, eventually came into private hands and was used for a variety of different reasons, including a page that outlines the family history of the Morton family in the late 17th century, recording marriages and births and deaths. And it's the same family that fixed the Bible and repaired all the damages. That's also an extraordinary case, but anytime I bring out 17th century books for my classes, even books that I've seen multiple times and that Colleen has seen, my students find new things inside them. And so there's really a lot more, there's really, many different stories you can tell about a particular book. And I see Rachel. Hi, Rachel. My former student, Rachel. It's her birthday today. Happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Also letting me know that one thing I just mentioned is that that there's a beer drinking song written on one of the pages. In the Bible, which was crossed out by the pious Morton family later. I'll also say, so Rachel did her undergrad thesis on a copy of Spencer's 1679 works in our collection that had been owned and annotated by a woman, and did some really fantastic work on that that's available on my website, adamghooks.net. And so, Rachel, I have a grad student now who's digging a little bit further into that particular copy of Spencer to see what else she can find there. So books have stories, like all sorts of stories that never stop unraveling themselves.
Yeah, but they're the ones that you find when you also pay attention to the container and not just the content. And I know that that's a challenge with library catalogs for rare books, because the traditional way of cataloging a book paid far more attention to the content than the container. And the way that people use rare books or historic books or special collections books, it's both. It's both. It's the interplay between the container and the content. What kind of binding was put on it, and when, and is there a history of multiple bindings? That tells us things about the owners. Marginalia, drinking songs, doodles, words crossed out, annotated. It's all, and the title pages. It's all of that information that tells us about the book. And it has to be both. So an ideal catalog record for a rare book will describe both the content and the container and give notes about the current state of the binding, of the paper, of the annotations, and all of those different features that are just about this one particular copy and not about the run of copies for that particular work. Okay, librarian speech off.
I have some related questions that I want to get to. I have one question that someone asked me. What is my favorite Shakespeare book, or book that is Shakespeare? Like my favorite copy of something defined that we might define as Shakespeare. And the added intrigue, I haven't actually had to have held it in my hands before.
Okay. So just it exists.
It exists, and it's my favorite. Even if I have, I will answer this question in two ways and say that maybe the most important book, Shakespeare book that I ever held, was a copy of the 1655 Lucrece held at the Folger Shakespeare Library. The 1655 edition includes this crazy continuation of Shakespeare's poem, written by a royalist poet. I found that book in my master's level seminar that I took at the Folger when I was doing my master's degree, working on my master's thesis, which I got to write in the old reading room at the Folger. And my thesis was about the poem Lucrece, and so the final section was about the material aspects of this particular edition. It was the first time I'd ever worked with an old book like this. It was really my first opportunity to do that, and it became the essay that I submitted to get into grad school. I've always had a fondness for it. I've gone back to it over the years and called it up again, because they have multiple copies, and there's a very specific copy that I remember writing about. And this is also I just had someone ask me, one of my students asked yesterday, is it difficult to publish something? And I said yes, because that essay that I wrote about the 1655 Lucrece, and I'll put a plug in here for the forthcoming collection, Canonizing Shakespeare, edited by my great friends Pete Kerwin and Emma DePledge, coming this fall from Cambridge University Press, September 2017. Keep your eyes out. So that essay will finally be in print 15 years after I first worked on it.
Congrats.
So never throw anything out that you're working on, folks.
I do think it's interesting that your first time working with a rare book was looking very closely, looking for and creating an essay. And my first time working with a rare book, I was sent as a library peon to go essentially digitize a medieval manuscript for a patron. Got out a camera. My first time working with a rare book, I was sent to photograph it. So that's,
yeah,
I don't know, draw conclusions if you want to. It's interesting, the different trajectories.
It's also the difference in teaching early literatures and teaching Shakespeare, the difference between when I was in college at Illinois in the 90s, Illinois with one of the great early modern book collections in the world. I mean, really, certainly as far as public institutions go, like universities, fabulous collection, in part built by T.W. Baldwin, but no one ever took me to special collections in a Shakespeare class. So really, my graduate work was the first time, which is one of the reasons why it's so important to get our students here at a similar public institution to get into the library.
First time that I set foot in any type of collection like this was when I didn't choose my undergraduate history internship. I was sent to this place called the Archives. Hadn't gone in class, was sent there for my internship, and that's the first time that I set foot in an archives or a special collections. So shout out for undergraduate internships, but also for all of the opportunities for taking classes. And I know that that's been a trend across the board in special collections and archives to increase instruction, but what a great opportunity to have hands-on time with historic materials. If you have a community group or anything like that, especially if you're around here, contact us. We'll put something together. You should have a chance.
Yes.
All right, I'm going to grab a pencil so we can keep asking you questions. Which direction do you want to go next? Book, a question?
Well, I'm actually going to answer the other half of the question, which is that I don't have to have ever held a book for it to be my favorite. there's a couple of different things I'm going to say about this. I think I do. I mean, there are a number of different ways I could answer that question. But this is how I'm going to do it. The first edition, the first quarto of Venus and Adonis, there is only a single copy that survives in the world. It wasn't found until the late 18th century. Venus and Adonis, the most popular, not only the most popular of Shakespeare's works in the 17th century, the most popular work of English poetry, period, in the period. Went through 16 editions, at least, in the 17th century. There are two different reasons that I can't wait to get my hands on that book the next time I'm in Oxford at the Bodleian. One is that Edmund Malone theorized that there had to have been a 1593 edition because it was entered in the Stationer's Register that year. And so he set about trying to find one. He finally did. And then he complained about how much it cost. Typical Malone. The second reason is that there's this great new resource, and I think I just tweeted this out, Shakespeare Documented, sponsored by the Folger. And I wrote a few entries on particular copies, particular editions of books that I have expertise on, including the Q1 Venus and Adonis. It's interesting because it was also owned by the 17th century book collector Francis Wolferston. So to go back to some of the earlier questions about different audiences, we know that a woman owned and read this poem, which is interesting in and of itself. But in the process of writing the essay and consulting both with the Folger librarians and curators and the curator in Oxford, it came to our attention that this book, I mean, the text of which is the copy text for every critical edition of Shakespeare's poem since the late 18th, early 19th century, that there was still a lot more to find in this book because no one had ever paid attention to the material features of the book. It's bound together with another work of poetry, which I didn't know about, and I never see noted in editions of the poems because they're so focused on the text rather than the artifact or the book. Not only was it bound together with another work of poetry, it was also signed by another owner very early, like in the first decade of the 17th century. So we have all this additional information that raises all these other questions about exactly how and when those two books were bound together, how they got into Francis Wolferston's library, the life of the book after that, all this stuff about one of the most, like, which should have been like the most recognized, famous Shakespeare books. So I want to get my hands on it.
All right. I have a follow-up from Megan H. on Facebook that relates to some of what we've talked about so far. So in what you were just talking about, you talked about stationers' registries, you talked about lists of plays and marginalia. So she was wondering, are there Shakespeare books that didn't survive, and specifically, how do we know about them? So besides the stationer's register and the list of plays that showed up with Love's Labours 1 listed, are there any other ways that we know about some texts that didn't survive? Like the range of evidence that lets us know that they did exist, even if they don't now exist.
I like this question a lot. It's actually maybe more interesting if it's not about Shakespeare. I mean, this would be like lost editions that don't survive. And there are a couple of examples where the very first edition of a Shakespeare work, thinking the first quarto of Henry IV, Part 1, and the first edition of The Passionate Pilgrim, both of the first editions exist only as a fragment. So we know there was an earlier edition. It's just that only a fragment survives. And Alan Farmer has done work on this, trying to identify survival rates. If a book has a statement of the edition on the title page, this is the 8th edition or this is the 12th edition, and you can't find, and there are not 8 surviving editions, and you know that you've lost one. But that's a very particular case. If you think beyond Shakespeare, you can look in the Stationer's Register for things that don't survive, and this is really helpful for things like ballads, because ballads are ephemeral, single sheet broadsheets. So, for example, the Ballad of Romeo and Juliet. Ballads were often created based on plays. There was a ballad on Romeo and Juliet. It just happens not to survive, but it was entered in the Stationer's Register, so we know. Megan, if you really want to know what are the different kinds of evidence for books that don't survive, one of the ways that you can do that is go to the Lost Plays database. That doesn't cover every play that was printed, because every play was not printed. And in fact, probably most plays were not printed. But the evidence survives to indicate that a play did exist by a particular title. And the Lost Plays database is a kind of wiki-style site with essays about particular lost plays.
Tweeting it.
Right, like my favorite one. This is a little detail I got from Jim Marino's book Owning William Shakespeare. It makes no sense for Osric in Hamlet, the kind of foppish courtier at the end, who's bringing Hamlet into the final duel. It makes no sense for Osric to be named Osric, because in one of the texts he is not given a name, but in the other text he is given a name. And the ways that actors' parts would have worked means that you would have to alter like many other actors' parts just to put the name Osric, to get the name on stage. I was like, why would you possibly do that? It makes no sense from a theater perspective, unless you know that there was a contemporary play called Osric that happens not to survive. So it's another way that Hamlet is producing a theatrical in-joke. We don't know exactly what the joke is because we don't have the play, obviously, but there you go.
Well, the second half of Megan's question I can tackle. Megan was wondering how you care for a 400-year-old book. And there's more than one way to answer this.
Yeah.
Because it depends on what you'd like to do with it, and how important it is to you. Because the answer depends on how much money you want to spend. If the most common type of damage you'll see with a book that old is the front hinge, the front cover of the book, being really weak or broken off the book. And one of the things you can do is tie it up with a cotton tie. You can also keep your book in a box that keeps it out of the light, and generally protects the book from shelf wear or any other kind of damage. So putting it in a box is a great way to care for it. If you really want to, if it has some type of like tears or damage like that, you can find a local conservator who can patch it back up with Japanese paper. And if it's somehow impeding with the functioning of the book, but then you're faced with the two directions. Do you want to just stabilize the book, which is now, you know, what an academic library would do? What can we do to make sure that this isn't going to deteriorate further as people use it? Or some collectors prefer to go a different route and they want it to come back to a sort of earlier brilliance that mimics how it would have looked, and more like a restoration. And so then it gets into super money territory. Where do you want to go? So tie it up with a string and put it in a box and email a local I'm not sure quite what happened. Okay, can you all still see us? I'm not sure what happened there. We had a glitch on our side where it just suddenly disappeared, but there we are. Here, I'll scoot it over
Just
again.
when I was about to rant about something.
Okay, well, you got to take a breath before ranting, and now you can take it away. So, what rant are you ready for?
Well, now I will
historic
begin.
books?
Yeah.
We were on ways to care for historic
ways
books
to
for
care
Megan H.
for historic books. One thing I will say, one of the fabulous things about our library is our conservation lab. And I got the privilege to work with them and the head, Giselle Simone, last summer when we were preparing for the Shakespeare exhibit here in the library. And those questions, it's also about a matter of time and resources. Decisions about how to conserve a particular book are driven in part by those questions. Like, what do we have time for? You know, there is an ideal treatment, but then there's the treatment that is more practical, that takes less time, and which is especially important for an exhibition.
Yeah, and also when you have, you know, if you have 50 books that currently need treatment, you know, you could spend all of your time working on just one, or you could do lighter treatment and help and support more books. So those are the types of decisions that a conservator at a big library like this has to consider. But it's slightly different if you have just one or two books at home.
I can tell you what you should not do with an old book that is damaged.
Good segue.
Damn right. What you should not do is break it apart and sell it, because this damages and destroys crucial information about the book. Even if it is fragmentary, that still tells you something about the life of the book. And if you tear it apart, you break it apart and sell it as individual leaves, you can make more money, I suppose, but you're doing a disservice to humanity. This was popular, especially early in the 20th century. Here is something I came across actually by mistake several years ago.
And I think we've discussed this in previous live streams.
It's pretty good. This is the original leaves.
Yeah, I'm gonna grab that camera. So here we go again.
Of the plays of William Shakespeare. So what this very limited edition has are actually individual leaves from all four of the folios published in the 17th century. So you get the fetishized object, a single page
of the first folio.
From the first folio.
Just one page, chopped up, separated from all of the others. A single page from a second folio.
From a second folio. I mean, you can see here the damage. I mean, these clearly come from. They came.
And someone just wrote second.
From damaged or fragmentary copies.
Third folio.
Yes, the students
stained. Likely a damaged
students
copy.
Like this one because from the third folio, this is the end of Romeo and Juliet.
Oh, well, and we're the only one then that has the end of Romeo and Juliet.
From that particular copy, right? So you know, I teach Romeo and Juliet. It's a famous play. It's the very end of the play, and so it's not just the aura of the artifact. It's actually interesting to students because of the actual content. And the same.
Yeah, and we also got Et tu, Brute.
Yeah, we got Et tu, Brute from Caesar, which my students noticed when I taught Julius Caesar. This was produced in the early 20th century. Leaf books.
We're going back.
Yeah, we'll just come back here. I mean, the really galling thing about this is that it's produced by a fine press, the Grabhorn Press in San Francisco, and it includes
1935.
It includes a scholarly introduction by one of the leading experts on the Shakespeare folios in the 1930s, Edwin Elliott Willoughby, who worked at the Folger Library and wrote a book about William Jaggard. So the fine press has printed this introduction that in part talks about the importance of the first folio, but then also bizarrely talks about the value of this for gaining knowledge, about like the fact that maybe you would find a textual variant on this particular page of the first folio. It's totally illogical, because you would never know. I mean, the best way to hide textual variants is to rip pages out of a book and send them God knows where elsewhere. So it's damaging parts of the book. We also have, and I'm pretty sure we've talked about this before, but just super quickly, we have an example of one of these versions in the collection. I have no idea how it got here.
Is this a single play?
This is the single play. It is the Life and Death of King John, the complete play extracted from a different copy of the second folio published in 1632.
Yeah, so the alternative from chopping it up into single leaves, this one separates the entire play.
The entire play.
So just one play from the compilation.
And you can tell, I mean, actually, Giselle, our conservator, asked me to double check with me last summer. It's like, are you sure you want to put this on display in the exhibition? Because it's a mess. Because very clearly the copy was damaged and the pages are in really bad shape, which is presumably why it was broken apart and sold. The odd thing about this is that we have a mostly complete second folio in our collection, and the leaf from the second folio in the leaf book is from King John. So we've got the same page from three different copies of King John. We have no idea how it got here, although when I did first discover that we had it, when I first arrived here in Iowa, I did a quick eBay search to see what else was out there. And at that time, you could purchase a complete King John on the internet, on eBay, because no one likes King John. And it's an overlooked play. It's not, there are no Hamlets or Romeo and Juliets available, but there were King Johns available. The reason I bring this up is that starting, where is it at?
I have a question about the history plays too, whenever we need to segue.
The reason I want to talk about this are these people I learned about this at the Shakespeare Association of America conference in Atlanta. And I wasn't able to see this in person at the book exhibit, but I heard firsthand reports, and it is now online. You can go to their website, Shakespeare200.com. Shakespeare with the number 200, to see the like terrible thing that they're doing, is that they've taken a copy of a second folio that apparently has been was damaged or fragmentary, and they're selling individual laminated leaves.
Laminated? What?
As a fundraiser.
Okay, it's Ask an Archivist Day, and you can ask this archivist, never laminate anything, ever. I mean, okay, if you need like little note cards or something, but just don't. There's no coming back from lamination. We can come back from water. You can, fire's a little more difficult, but water you can come back from. Mold, with enough money, you can come back from.
It's not laminated.
Okay.
It is
you're getting me
quotation
all riled up.
The quotation from the site, an archival museum quality acrylic case.
Okay.
Although
That's different from lamination.
Someone who told me about this, I mean, it's also galling that they would be allowed to have a booth in the book exhibition at the Shakespeare Association conference. I have no idea how that happened. But someone described it to me as it looked like people who collect baseball cards, the stuff that you put baseball cards in. So what they've done is they have 200 leaves, I guess, from what they claim is an imperfect second folio, And they're auctioning them off starting on Friday as a fundraiser for the Atlanta Shakespeare Company. And they're advertising it as a limited edition, which I don't know how like fragments sent to different places could ever be thought of as a limited edition. But in part, they're pricing the leaves by the content of the leaf. Like if there's a famous quotation on that page, I guess maybe it costs more money. It's just so misguided in so many different ways, and kind of emblematic of the ways that the Shakespeare folios have been used and misunderstood at particular times within the theater. Some people believe that the punctuation in the first folio reveals how Shakespeare wanted you to perform the lines. Of course, that's not true because of the various mediations of the printing house. But just as like, we generally don't make leaf books anymore because we value the evidence even of fragmentary copies. And so this is just, I mean, right? Like like this is part of my pedagogy, right? Like the story of how my students broke the front cover of the binding of the second folio off.
19th century binding.
Late 19th, early 20th century, I think, in fact, and it was already damaged and was repaired. But the problem with that binding is that our second folio the pages have been washed and it's been repaired and it's erased crucial evidence of how the book was used. So we want to keep things fragmentary so that we can understand part of the life history of that rather than splitting it apart and making it into some kind of fetish object, which it totally is. The other, so yeah, like metaphorically breaking Shakespeare apart, not actually breaking Shakespeare apart and selling them off to the highest bidder. A conversation that we had briefly on Twitter just before we started with Emma Smith, who's literally not only written the book, but written 3 books about the first folio, talks about the fact that there is a page from the first folio used as binding waste in a book that she knows about, which is really remarkable, thinking about the value that a single page has now, that at a certain point in time it was worthless enough to be used as binding waste. Another example very recently that came to light and got a lot of attention is a leaf from the Gutenberg Bible that was used to bind another book. And again, the Gutenberg Bible, that was the first leaf book that was created in the early 20th century. It was a damaged copy, incomplete, of the Gutenberg Bible, and kind of inaugurated this trend for doing this. You should not do that. I mean, goodness gracious.
I do.
Can we ask
yeah.
Sarah's question now?
Sure.
I think that it relates.
Which one?
About the question, since we're talking about folios, which copy of the first folio is my favorite copy? And it's not something I'd ever thought about at all. Because of my complicated relationship with that book, #folio fatigue. I bring this up because one of my favorite stories about a particular first folio that I wrote about in my book is what is now cataloged as Folger copy #1. It's the copy that Isaac Jaggard gave to the Herald Augustine Vincent, a presentation copy as a gift for cooperating with the Jaggards in this complicated story about a heraldry book. So it's a presentation copy. It's it's presented from the Jaggards. It's also the tallest, most untrimmed copy. And when it came to light, the story is, in a dusty room, damaged with just a bunch of old books in a pile. When it was finally recognized and then repaired, Henry Folger did nothing. Like he was going to have that book, and it was described because of its physical state in these bizarre physical terms. as precious and beautiful, and it's just so clearly like the most fetishized copy of the most fetishized book. There's a popular book about the first folio that was published several years ago, where the writer, who's not a Shakespeare expert, like pesters Betsy at the circulation desk at the Folger until she finally relents and like shows the damn book to him. I've never seen it in person. I have no desire to see it in person. In fact, I have never called up a copy of the first folio anywhere ever. So I mean, the other way to answer Sarah's question is actually, I don't know which copy is my favorite, but the first one I ever saw in person that was not behind a glass case was, again, during my master's degree, when we got a tour of the conservation lab at the Folger, and there was a copy of the first folio that was just lying in pieces on the conservator's desk because it was being treated. So I can't remember, it was maybe like Henry IV Part 2. It was just like there, lying by itself on the table, which gave me a totally different perspective on it. I mean, Sarah, this is not actually answering your question, but I think it's really interesting, particularly considering the first folio tour last year, where they 18 separate folios sent around to all 50 states, displayed only to a single page opening, so that they seem to be interchangeable and identical because all the identifying information had been hidden, so that we couldn't tell anyone which copy of the first folio we had because of security reasons, which was too bad because there were all sorts of really interesting copy-specific things about the copy that was downstairs in our library gallery, but that's not the service to which the book was being put. It was there to be enshrined in an altar to represent the cultural authority of Shakespeare. So I'm kind of fond of the one that just happened to randomly be assigned to us, because of the things that I now know about it, having never actually touched it or seen it when it was not in a glass case. Yeah. I know you didn't ask me to rant, but I was on the tail end of a rant, so I just kind of kept going.
Can we segue to a question about the history plays?
Sure.
All right. So this question's for Hugo, who's been watching. Hi, Hugo. For the historical plays, would an audience know these stories, or were they presented as propaganda? He is wondering particularly about Richard III.
I can answer Richard III. We were just talking about the illustrated version of Richard III earlier. I love teaching Richard III. Students love Richard III. It's a really compelling story that engages students in a whole variety of ways. 2 or 3 different things here. One, yes, of course, everyone would know the general outline of the story, particularly of someone as notorious as Richard III, which, if you're remembering, in the 1590s was not that long ago, just a handful of generations ago, are when these events took place. Right? I mean, Queen Elizabeth is on the throne. The overthrow of Richard III is the start of the Tudor dynasty, and so, like, the historical proximity to Richard is a lot closer than we might think today. Yeah, so of course people would know the general outlines. So in some sense, the interesting thing for audiences would be how Shakespeare reshaped these stories for theatrical purposes, how he condensed or conflated events together, telescoping events in the narrative so that things happen at the same time that never happened together in history but work really well theatrically. Richard III in particular, ever since his skeleton was found under the car park in Leicester a few years ago, has become a lot more present. And it is clear that some of the historical chronicles distorted the view of Richard, particularly his deformed body, and Shakespeare accentuates that even further. But Richard III was not only the most notorious villain on the Renaissance stage, he was also a notoriously seductive character. One of my favorite stories is about a besotted playgoer who makes a rendezvous with the lead actor in the company, still dressed in character as Richard III, right? And so, like Richard, and in fact, the play bears that out, right? Richard doesn't do a whole lot, but he seduces and manipulates people into doing things. As far as the propaganda, it's not really fair to call it that. I mean, back in the middle of the 20th century, there was a particular view of the history plays as a kind of prop for the Tudor state, which then was kind of overthrown by New Historicism in the 80s and 90s, which preferred a more contrarian, subversive Shakespeare. Both of those views of history, though, of Shakespeare's view of history, are based on considering the plays, particularly the ones that depict contiguous events, what are often called the two tetralogies, of thinking of them as a linked sequence, and that's just not how they were always considered, and they're certainly never performed as much until after Wagner's Ring Cycle debuted in the late 19th century. So there's all sorts of kind of contextual, historical implications that people have answered that question differently over time. But the one thing that is clear, generic instability aside, is that Richard's a really attractive character. I mean, my students love that play, and it's a really great introduction to Shakespeare because it's so clearly about the ways that language works, which is one of the reasons why I like to teach it. So that's a great question.
Thanks, Hugo. I've got more.
Awesome.
Depends on which direction you want to go. We definitely have a lot of people asking about co-authorship.
Yep.
And so that's a topic that people are continually interested in. I have a question about who else is worth reading from the time.
Oh, that's interesting. These are all, and then the question of like where, especially for something like the history plays, right? Like where did Shakespeare get what were his sources?
Yes, yeah. Was there a library for playwrights? Was there a library that he had access to? Where did Shakespeare get access to sources for books for the plays?
I mean, the question is like everywhere, right? He could have had access to the library of a patron. He presumably had his own kind of library. He would have known. He could have browsed the bookstalls in London. And kind of like elaborate theories have been created to explain how Shakespeare got access to books, like that he must have been a printer himself. And then most of these are just hearsay, if not outright ridiculous, because books were everywhere. And especially some of the what we consider to be large, expensive books, like chronicles, historical chronicles, they're also available in multiple formats, smaller, cheaper, more accessible formats. So we didn't necessarily always have to be sitting around with a 3-volume Holinshed to write the history plays. So there's just a whole range of opportunities for Shakespeare to access books. We don't know if or like presumably he had his own collection of books. We don't know the extent of that. There was an inventory of his possessions made after he died, but that's been lost. That would have accompanied the will. And also, like thinking about, I mean, this is why another reason why it's misguided to believe that you found Shakespeare's dictionary or you found Shakespeare's copy of Holinshed. These are both claims that have been made, one in the 50s, one much more recently, about finding Shakespeare's dictionary. Is not only is the evidence and the interpretation of the evidence incorrect and misguided, it's a very limited definition of what constitutes a source, as if Shakespeare is sitting there like with such a limited imagination that he can't write a line without consulting a dictionary multiple times, because sources are not only textual, it's just that source studies concentrates on printed books because printed books survive. songs and ballads and folk tales don't survive. News that's transmitted by word of mouth doesn't survive. Plays that influenced Shakespeare, like the version of Hamlet that existed as a play before Shakespeare's Hamlet, those have been lost. We don't know. So I mean, sometimes my students are really upset by that. It's like, how can we ever recover really Shakespeare's sources, because we can't recover what was in the air, like literally what was in the air, the sounds that are in the air.
And just one additional remark about libraries. There wasn't such a thing like what we think of as a public library at the time. So I know Adam mentioned patrons. So if a rich person had a library, it was possible, you know, to come and use someone's library, someone's specific personal library. But the open sort of community public library wasn't really a thing.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. So it's a different definition mm-hmm. Of a library as far as that goes. Mm-hmm. And you know, like some theater historians have shown that rather than oftentimes you know, kind of playing companies might, like, if a play becomes popular, you try to commission or produce or perform a kind of imitation. You know, there are particular fashions for kinds of plays. And so in that sense, like, other plays are sources for plays as well. And this is part, I know that several people asked about kind of collaboration and, mm-hmm. and co-authorship, because this is something that's been in the news a lot recently.
Yep, we have a question from KT and from Hugo about co-authorship and just how common it is, whether Marlowe was involved, and just any sort of remarks that you want to make about collaboration and co-authorship.
I would say that the best place to go if you're a general reader and you want to know how scholars think about collaboration and co-authorship, and attribution studies in particular, which attempts to determine exactly which writers are responsible for particular parts of a play, particular lines. I'll give a shout out to Andy Kesson and his Before Shakespeare project. Andy wrote a very thoughtful post on the Before Shakespeare blog about attribution studies. Mm-hmm. It was responded to by many of the leading scholars in the field, and so it's a really interesting read. Some of it's a really interesting read, I should say. Some of it might scare off general readers. Some of it actually would, because attribution studies, part of Andy's point is that attribution studies tends to be a bit insular and provocative.
So speaking of attribution studies, what is involved with that? Because that was part of Katie's question as well. Like, what is it that they do?
That's a question I'm not fully qualified to answer, but I will say that the reason this has been getting attention recently is that the new Oxford Shakespeare was recently published, and the general editors there and editors for the plays used attribution studies, stylometrics, comparing particular aspects of the language to a larger corpus of an author's works to try to determine not only if a play is collaborative, but who may have collaborated with Shakespeare. I mean, it shouldn't be a surprise, but because this is how plays were written, but Shakespeare collaborated on a whole bunch of plays, and there's nothing wrong with that, because that's just the ways that playwrights work together. The reason that the New Oxford got this attention is that it put Christopher Marlowe's name on the title page of the Henry VI plays. Claiming not only, as we've known for a long time, a play like Henry VI Part 1 was collaborative. That claim's been made for since the 18th century, pretty much. But claiming it as Marlowe catches the public attention. I mean, I will say I have no horse in this race. I actually don't care who wrote which lines of Shakespeare's plays. I'm interested in why people are interested in who wrote which lines of Shakespeare plays, particularly Marlowe, because he's the other famous recognizable figure from the Renaissance, and because he's also known as the bad boy of the Elizabethan theater, a reputation he acquired because of the nature of his violent death, but only really became an attraction rather than something to be morally condemned in the 20th century. So it's because Marlowe is this well-known figure, people have always wanted to know the exact nature of the influence between Marlowe and Shakespeare. Marlowe wrote Hero and Leander. Shakespeare wrote his narrative poem, Venus and Adonis, very similar. Marlowe wrote Edward II. Shakespeare's Richard II seems to be influenced by that. And some of Shakespeare's early history plays seem to be influenced by Marlowe. I mean, the Henry VI plays are early in Shakespeare's career. They're certainly indebted to the kinds of plays Marlowe wrote. Tamburlaine in particular, even though no one knew Marlowe wrote Tamburlaine in the 16th century. So it's attempting to use new digital tools to prove or to make a more substantial claim that fulfills the desire that people have wanted since they started paying attention to Marlowe back in the 19th century. The reason Marlowe was rediscovered in the 19th century is as a precursor to Shakespeare. So Marlowe's identity has always been shaped by our attitudes towards Shakespeare and his kind of precedence over the model that Marlowe offered before his early death. So what the New Oxford Shakespeare does in putting Marlowe's name on the title page, it's not only making the larger important point that Shakespeare collaborated on a number of plays, which experts have known this for a while, but it makes people interested because it's Marlowe in particular. And it seems to offer not only the evidence of computer-aided stylometrics, which is far too complicated to explain in the next 3 minutes, but also like the imprimatur of Oxford University Press, claiming that this is a play co-written by Shakespeare and Marlowe and maybe someone else. So it really places the emphasis on collaboration as a collection of individually authored lines rather than thinking about alternate forms of collaboration.
The creative process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, in ways that can never be recovered from the existing texts, probably.
We're coming up upon 1 o'clock. That's just incredible. How on earth did that happen? We just keep talking. I am interested in this as a final question, but if you have something that you want to end on.
Yeah, no, let's end on this because it's not about Shakespeare.
Yeah, and I think that's a good segue, especially because we were just coming out of talking about Marlowe. And the question is, who else should we be reading from the time? You know, if Shakespeare has gotten this overlarge reputation, or has carried on through the centuries with so much acclaim, and we all read something in high school, who's been overlooked? Who should we have been reading?
Answer this in a couple of different ways, because there was also a question on Twitter from Aaron. Hey, Aaron. About like ways in which special collections can actually aid in broadening the perspective of students or of just the general public as well about the Shakespeare-centric nature of Renaissance studies in particular and culture more generally. I think we all feel Shakespeare fatigue after the events of 2016, and having hosted the folio exhibit and crafted an exhibition and held a semester full of events in 2016. We were literally exhausted.
But there are many for whom that is an excitement yet to come.
It's the obverse. Aaron's question is the obverse of what we did last fall, which is to use Shakespeare as a hook to demonstrate to people all sorts of different resources available in the library, demonstrate the value of the humanities for that the university offers to the state and to the country, to the citizens of Iowa, and to show off what our students do Like, so, I mean, a lot of the Shakespeare events weren't really about Shakespeare. And in fact, a good portion of the Shakespeare exhibit, which will be digitized and online very soon, shakespeare.lib.uiowa.edu. A preliminary version of that is up already. We're still building it. You can see there's a lot of books that just have nothing to do with Shakespeare. But it's a way to teach people about the culture of the time. So that's one way to do it, is to, like, we literally surrounded the panels from the Folger that emphasized Shakespeare with the actual context for Shakespeare, allowing people to access that
both
in different ways. And we do that with classes as well. You know, our librarians have set up sessions on Shakespeare and artist books, where it really doesn't have much to do with Shakespeare. It's just a mere stepping stone to creating something new. Where I often bring out, you know, classical literature, like his influence Ovid, or we do sessions with Bibles to talk about religious culture, other authors, right? Because the actual number of early Shakespeare materials that we have is very limited, because that's all really expensive. So the 17th and early 18th century materials that we have are primarily not of Shakespeare. You know, we have little sample bands of random plays from the late 17th and early 18th century, which give people a sense of how people interacted with plays. So that's one way to think about it, is to consciously move beyond. And one of the ways that teachers can do that, who have access to special collections of any kind, is just to randomly call things up, or to build a kind of teaching collection. I mean, if you can search for, I was just doing this the other day because I'm a nerd and this is what I do, but browsing online sites for cheap copies of Shakespeare's poems in different editions from different times, so you can do that as well. I mean, it's actually, the question of who else is worth reading from the time, I'll spin that a little bit. Is like, pick up any decent anthology of drama or poetry or literature from the period. You're going to find lots and lots of worthy authors, and you can find your way yourself. I mean, it is more accessible than ever. There is a plethora. I mean, there are many anthologies and collections and companion volumes about Shakespeare's contemporaries, and so there's no shortage of avenues to find that. I would actually like talk about, because one of my own students wanted me to talk about this today, like, what are Shakespeare's more overlooked works, like the most overlooked, right? We mentioned King John, not the most famous of Shakespeare's plays.
As a parting thought.
Yeah, because I'm teaching this class for the first time, called Shakespeare's Poetry, and we're reading a couple of plays, but mainly we're reading Shakespeare's poems, which tend to get overlooked because of the fact that they're not plays. This is something that I've worked on in my scholarship.
Okay, so answer number one.
For a long time.
Shakespeare's poems.
Shakespeare's poems, like The Phoenix and the Turtle, this short little poem, blew the minds of my students. Like, totally blew their minds. This crazy quasi-metaphysical meditation on love and death and love in death. Just like fantastic. We read Venus and Adonis, which was a lot of fun. We read Lucrece, which gave us all a headache in the best possible way, making us work through really tough issues. So it's the overlooked and unfamiliar Shakespeares are the ones that I would suggest that you focus on. So particularly the poems. The other thing I would say, to finally finish it off, I mentioned that website, Shakespeare Documented, and I also mentioned that, like, the book that I want to get my hands on the most is Q1 of Venus and Adonis, that one unique copy. I think people, I mean, scholars and also just people who are interested, should take a spin through that site, because everyone always wants the first edition. Editors always want the first edition. It's the closest to Shakespeare's lost manuscripts, and people ignore the later editions, which is too bad, for all sorts of different reasons. And so, you know, thinking about later Shakespeare, unfamiliar Shakespeare, fragmented Shakespeare, the Shakespeares that seem to be the opposite of the monolithic cultural entity that we have, that drives people to rip apart a second folio and sell individual leaves. I had to come back to that.
Well, thank you so much for tuning in to this 4th Shakespeare live stream. And thank you for all of your questions. And I'm very sorry to all of you whose questions we didn't get to. Clearly, you continue to inspire and baffle and infuriate Professor Adam Hooks. And it's been a delight, and we'll be back next year. Thanks.
We'll see you then.